So if you're one of the millions and millions of people who have gone on unemployment or lives have been thrown upside down by the coronavirus, you've probably been paying attention to the news a lot more over the last couple of days because the extra $600 unemployment benefits ran out at the end of July. And so there's been a lot of people who are, struggling right now, trying to figure out how they're going to pay the bills. And so they've been paying a lot of attention to, are these benefits going to be extended? And now we finally have somewhat of an answer with Trump signing an executive order to try to extend them. But it's not that simple. So first of all, we got here because for the past 2 weeks, the White House and Democratic leaders have been negotiating a new coronavirus stimulus bill. This would be a follow-up to the CARES Act that passed months ago. Depending on which side you listen to, they can't even decide which coronavirus stimulus bill this actually is. So the idea of them getting a deal was kind of remote, but they've been talking about it for the last 2 weeks. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Steve Mnuchin, and Mark Meadows have been in a room together for the last 2 weeks trying to get a deal done here. Now, when I first heard about all this, to be honest with you, even though I'm not a big fan of the guy, the fact that Mitch McConnell wasn't a part of these negotiations was a bad sign from the get-go. I mean, he runs, well, whether you like him or not, and I personally don't like him, he runs the Republican caucus in the Senate. So he would have to be a part of any deal that was going to actually get struck. So the fact that he wasn't even in the negotiations was a very bad sign. And in general, this is why people hate Congress, right? This is why people get so frustrated with our government, because the Democrats actually signed a new stimulus bill. They passed one in the House in May. It's a $3 trillion bill called the HEROES Act. And, that's where the Democrats started months ago. And the Republicans, they've just sat on it. They haven't done anything about it for months. And then all of a sudden, in the last couple of weeks, now they're scrambling to try to figure out what they're going to do. And there was a bill that's already been passed. They just haven't been doing anything. And so the Democratic bill had a couple of things going for it. It was a very massive bill, $3 trillion. And what it did was it extended that extra $600 of unemployment until 2021. It also gave money for state and local governments, many of whom are at the point of bankruptcy right now. They're bleeding money trying to fight the coronavirus. So for those of you who don't kind of understand this little aspect, state governments and local governments, cities, towns, they have to actually balance their budget, right? So they have to, they collect a certain amount of tax revenue, and then they allocate that budget for each year for their city or state. But the thing about the federal government is they essentially print their own money. I mean, yes, the federal government does collect taxes from us, and they allocate that taxes. But whenever you hear about deficit spending, that's basically where Congress is like, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna keep printing money or borrow money, and that's how that pays for things. Like right now, I think the last year there was like a $3.5 trillion of tax revenue for the United States, and the budget was $4.4 trillion. So that's before the coronavirus happened. So that's we were already looking at a bad budget. So this next one's not gonna be looking so good. But back to the main point was that a lot of these local governments are just flat out of cash. And so this Democratic bill was going to give more money. It was also going to give money or tuition reimbursement for first responders as a way of thanking them for putting so much time and effort in fighting this pandemic. I mean, you hear about people sleeping in their garages or, working 12-hour shifts every day for weeks and weeks on end. And so the Democratic bill wanted to try to, help those people out. The GOP bill is a little different. They were looking at a max of $1 trillion bill. And that $1 trillion bill was going to cap unemployment at $200 a week for 3 months. And then it was going to be 70% of what your pay was after that. The thing about this, which it really doesn't make any sense because, Congress first initially figured out that was impossible. Just because of how the states work. We have 50 different states that have 50 different unemployment offices that are doing 50 different things. When this all first happened, there were some states that were literally reaching out to people who knew how to code this antiquated coding system because it was so ancient. They put no money into their infrastructure. So all of a sudden, when millions of people went on unemployment, it shut down the system. And so for a lot of states and areas, there's no way to figure out what 70% of what someone was making before. And it was just impossible. And Congress figured this out months ago. And that's why they gave the extra just flat out $600 to everyone, because they couldn't do anything else. And so the GOP bill and a lot of Republicans have been complaining, saying that extra $600 has actually been a deterrent from returning to work. There's a lot of folks out there that are actually, I think it's actually 60 or 70% of people are making more on unemployment than they were when they were actually working. Me personally, I think it's a sign that we need a $15 minimum wage. They should have been making more before, but that's another video. The two other points about the GOP bill was that it was going to put aside money, for a very little money, for local and state governments. Hardly anything for them, which sucks that they were just going to kind of let them go bankrupt and figure it out. It also, and this last point of it, I think is the worst part of their bill. Letting local governments kind of, go bankrupt is one thing, but they wanted liability protection for businesses during this coronavirus pandemic. And they wanted to protect businesses, not you. Essentially what the deal was is that, let's say you go to work and your boss has no rules about the coronavirus. There's nothing set up to try to keep you safe from the coronavirus at work. So let's say you get sick. Let's say you get really sick. Let's say you go to the hospital. Let's say maybe, something really bad happens to you or your family. Well, what Congress, specifically Republicans, wanted to do is make it impossible for you to sue your employer. Even if their negligence played some role in you getting sick, they wanted to make it impossible for you to file a lawsuit. But on the flip side is they wanted to allow your employer to be able to sue you. They wanted, like, for example, let's say you were sick. Maybe you're asymptomatic. Maybe you came in and worked even when you shouldn't have. But they want to make it possible so that if they can prove that you brought the virus into their facility or into their place of business, and they had to shut down for any amount of time, they wanted to make it possible for you to get sued for that downtime, which, yeah, I could go on how horrible that is, but that's a big sticking point. And that's what one of the big things of why this talk broke down. I mean, the idea that Democrats were going to sign off on liability to protection, I could have told you that was a non-starter. And the rumor is that Steve Mnuchin actually wanted to make a deal here, but Mark Meadows might have shut it down. So Mark Meadows is the chief of staff for the White House. He kind of, he runs the president's schedule, all that kind of stuff. And he's a really big, kind of political point person in the White House. That's what that job kind of is. And so the rumor is that he kind of blew up the negotiations because he wasn't willing to step back at all. And the Democrats actually took off $1 trillion off of their proposal. So they were trying to get to the point that we could make a deal here. But a big sticking point was that money for local governments. Essentially, and this is kind of what Mark Meadows was kind of getting at, and what Trump himself has talked about, is that they think the Democrats want to use money to basically, give to local governments, and local governments were going to use this money to pay off other debts, not coronavirus related. There's no facts there. There's nothing real there to back that up. That's what they were thinking. And this unfortunately shows how it's all become political. If you look at the virus and how it's, largely affected some communities, it's a lot of areas that are, at least for months, it was areas that were metropolitan areas. So a lot of folks packed together in cities with, like high density populations, because again, this virus spreads through the air, and the closer you're packed in with people, the more likely you're going to get sick. And a lot of those places are run by Democrats. And so the Republicans essentially didn't want to give those areas funding and money because it's a Republican administration and those are Democratic governors and mayors. And they just didn't want to help them out on principle. I know that sounds horrible, and I know that sounds kind of out there, maybe a little conspiracy-ish. But unfortunately, that's how things work a lot of times in politics. The interesting thing with the Trump campaign is that, and in other presidential administrations, is even if stuff like this went on, they were smart enough not to actually say it out loud. But the Trump administration will actually say it out loud. And so what Trump actually did was, with his executive order, is they put an eviction on moratoriums. There's been a federal eviction on moratoriums, and they extended that. Also, they're putting off student loans. And I think this is an indefinite thing. I haven't heard a whole lot of specifics on that. But essentially, they're postponing student loans. They're also they started out with a permanent and then went back to a temporary cut on payroll taxes. And this is actually has a lot of folks upset because payroll taxes essentially funds things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, programs that were already having funding problems already. So the fact that this was originally going to be a permanent thing, and now I think it's to the end of the year, but that's a big chunk of taxes that aren't going to be paid into those programs. And that could have a huge effect on your taxes come April. So we'll see what happens there. But that could be a huge problem. Also, it did extend that unemployment, that extra benefit, extra money there in unemployment, but it lowered it a little bit. So it cut it down to $400 a week, down from $600 a week. And so people are still going to get some of the help they need, but the idea is that, it's going to be less money for folks. So they're hoping it will be less of a deterrent to going back to work. Again, I don't think it's a deterrent for people to go back to work. And statistically, most people are saying that they're spending it on bills, food, groceries, all that kind of stuff. You could maybe think they're lying. Who knows? That's what they're saying. But again, I don't think that's what's stopping people from going back to work. There is this whole pandemic thing going on now, in case you hadn't heard. But the big thing here is that Trump, in some ways, may be taking the political high ground. So Democrats are obviously furious about this. They don't want to cut unemployment, and theoretically, they could stop the Trump administration by suing in court. But that's a really bad look. If they're going to sue to stop these benefits from getting out to people, then people are going to be angry at the Democrats. And when we're 90-ish or so days away from an election, that's not a good thing. So the big problem with these executive orders is it's not exactly clear where the money's going to come from. So the thing is, how it works is the president can allocate funds, but the Congress sets the budget. The president has to sign off on it, but the president can't just say, hey, we're going to spend all this money. Congress controls the bank. And so there's still supposedly some money left over from the CARES Act, but it's not clear how much and if it's enough to fund unemployment and some of these other things for much time at all. So again, and this happens a lot with executive orders, especially Trump executive orders, they're kind of like, we're going to do this without any clear guidelines on how we're actually going to do that thing they're talking about. So we are definitely not out of the woods yet. I mean, I know a lot of people were very happy when this executive order thing went down, but realistically, there is kind of more questions than answers right now. So I'll be paying attention over the next couple of weeks to try to figure out what's going on here. But how has this roller coaster affected you? I mean, I've heard from a lot of folks that are on unemployment right now because their jobs have been eliminated or they're shut down because of the virus. And I mean, it's pretty horrible. I mean, there's people who are literally having trouble. They're trying to figure out, am I going to pay the mortgage? Am I going to buy food for my kids? It's been really hard for a lot of people. So, shoot me a note down in the comment section there and let me know how you're doing with all this. Hey, what's going on, everyone? Thank you so much for watching Citizen Pete. I really appreciate it. If you haven't already, click that little subscribe button, maybe the like button, and hey, maybe just leave a comment. I want to know what you're thinking. What do you think about all the politics, the news, and all the stuff that's going on in our country?